This week's episode of our show has been sponsored by Stibble's Codex of Companions, which is now available for pre-order at the Ghostfire Games online store.
Designed by our amazing friend Logan at Runesmith, this book is jam-packed full of crazy critters to add to your games.
Your characters can befriend these companions and follow them on their adventures. So for all of you that have a party that is notorious for building up a small menagerie of adorable followers, this is the perfect way to get some rules for that so that you can control the chaos that such creatures bring.
So you can add all of these fun and adorable little monsters to your adventuring party by pre-ordering the book using the links below.
Stibble's Codex is coming off the rails of a fantastically successful Kickstarter campaign and is now coming up for pre-order for its eventual delivery very soon.
So check out that pre-order in the description below. And now, onto this week's episode.
Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything Dungeons & Dragons, including advice for players and guides for Dungeon Masters.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Now, Kelly and I have discussed how to roleplay your character and invent your character's backstory well many times on this channel before, but today we wanted to dive in a little bit and discuss a peculiar set of role-playing guidelines that were introduced in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. These are the personality traits, bonds, ideals, and flaws that are attached to the various character backstories presented in 5th edition and many other 5th edition supplements.
Backgrounds help determine who your character was before the adventure began, but oftentimes players focus on the backstory elements rather than the personality traits, ideals, bonds, and flaws, which are the actionable ideas that actually create role-playing circumstances at the table. Your backstory is more the history of your character that you can pull on and integrate into the story in meaningful ways, whereas your traits are something that is always going to be active and is something that you can reliably roleplay on and help to fuel the personality of your character in the adventures you go on.
These traits are more than just fun quirks to make your character talk in a funny voice, although that's part of it. They also influence the way that your character makes decisions and choices in the game. And we're not talking about necessarily the decisions that your character makes in combat or why they decided to take the fireball spell over the lightning bolt spell. We're talking about those really meaty character decisions and sometimes even the moral quandaries that your character may face. Over my years of running games of Dungeons & Dragons, I have had many players who have written elaborate backstories for their characters, but when they sat down to play the game at their table, the character had the personality of a wet paper bag.
So by looking at personality traits, ideals, bonds, and flaws, we can create a more fleshed out character using the backstory that you created and bring your character to life in meaningful ways, rather than just presenting a two-dimensional character with an interesting backstory. There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling.
The personality traits are kind of the hardest one to figure out of all of these, I find, because it's the biggest grab bag for your character, and oftentimes you're going to want to pick maybe even 2 or 3 of these things to give yourself some notes for roleplaying.
Now, first and foremost, we should discuss what is a personality trait, because discussing that helps differentiate it from all the other options. A personality trait to me is a mannerism or a quirk, or something that you can reliably pull on that defines the way that your character interacts with the world around them.
You can think of personality traits like your character's general disposition. You might have a ornery old wizard who is always cranky and telling kids to get off his lawn. You might be an optimistic young gnomish rogue who is always looking on the bright side of the situation. Or you might be more of a mercenary who is always looking out for what's in it for them. This is just the general framework by which your character approaches the world and how they interact with most other people, and gives you this kind of easy thing to fall back on as a default.
You could even use something like a habit or a hobby to influence your personality trait. Perhaps they have a special coin that they're always rubbing in their hands as they're making decisions, or they have a collection of small rocks that they find that are interesting to them, and so they're always picking up rocks and examining them as they're going on their adventure.
Perhaps your character is a devoted member of a religion, and they are always quoting from their religion's scripture. Maybe your character had a previous profession or is something that they're very passionate about, like food or money or books, and they're always talking about things in metaphors that deal with food, money, or books. Perhaps your character just has a couple sayings or catchphrases that they always utter under a specific set of circumstances, like when they're going into battle or when they're agreeing to take on a new quest.
So then the question becomes, how do you make personality traits actionable at the table? And my general rule of thumb for this is that you want to pick something simple. You don't want something convoluted or confusing that you need to dig really deep to pull out at the table. Something like catchphrases or hobbies or quirks are something that you can reliably fall back onto time and time again in any social situation in the game. By making a personality trait that is easy for you to latch onto, easy for you to broadcast, and easy for you to roleplay, it means that without much effort, you're able to bring your character to life in a meaningful way.
These personality traits might become a bit of a meme or a cliche, but they're actually a great way to define the framework of your character. And over the course of a campaign, these things are going to evolve and change, and you're going to find new ways to reinvent these things. That's part of the reason why people love memes, because they're always evolving and changing, but they're built on a template that can be readily adapted to a variety of situations.
As we jump into ideals, these are probably the strongest core of who your character is. Your ideal is what your character believes as their outlook on the world.
Ideals are things that your character believes about the world that guide their decisions and actions. Oftentimes, characters hold their ideals very, very strongly. They are your convictions and your principles. But they don't always have to be positive or good in nature. In fact, one of the great ways to think about your character's ideals are to actually connect them a little bit to your character's alignment, if you're using that.
Make sure that when you're designing the ideal for your character that you are taking a stance on something. There needs to be a concept that your character cares about enough to argue that point to everybody around them. This could cause some conflict within the characters or with other NPCs, but that can also be an interesting story element. As long as your character holds true to something and believes in something, you have something to latch onto for role-playing social situations in Dungeons & Dragons. A great way to look at ideals, to make them come to life, is to simply start them with the phrase, I believe X because Y.
And oftentimes, that second part of the sentence is a great thing to connect to your character's backstory. For example, your character's ideal might be, I will always stand up for the underdog because I was bullied as a child. That's a great ideal. It means that your character sees themselves, sees their empathy in other people and how they interact with things. And oftentimes that's how our own ideals and what we believe about the world develop naturally over the course of our lives. Things happen to us and the people that we care about, and we either learn lessons in life and don't want to see those repeated. For example, a character might also believe very strongly that, hey, you always got to keep some money hanging around because I grew up in poverty and we never had enough. And so your character's ideal is always about being prepared for when the bad times might come around again.
Your ideal should be bold. It should be a bold statement that is more than just a value. Your character might value knowledge, but knowledge is not enough to make up a compelling ideal. However, knowledge is power, and we should share knowledge to make the world a better place is an ideal. Or knowledge is power and should be safeguarded so that people don't misuse it is another great ideal.
Your ideals could get your character into trouble. Perhaps one of your character's ideals is, I believe in truth, and I will never hold it back no matter what. Alternatively, your character might have a very, very strong belief in confidence and bravery, and so they'll never back down from a fight, which could get them killed when they should have ran away or kept their mouth shut.
So in summary, a great way to make a compelling ideal for your character is to finish the statement, I believe X because Y, and linking that Y statement to your backstory and deciding how that element is actually an actionable role play that you can bring to the table in any social situation.
Take a stance with your ideals. Believe in something. Heroes have bold beliefs.
Speaking of heroes, heroes are often going to have responsibilities, and these are defined by your bonds. Your bonds are your call to action for adventure. They are the reason that your character is not giving up on the quest that they are on.
Bonds define the things that your character cares about in the world. But unlike an ideal, which can be somewhat intangible and philosophical, a bond is often something that is concrete and material. A great bond is often a proper noun, such as a person, a place, or a thing that is readily identifiable and can be readily threatened.
Your bond could also be an obligation or a responsibility that you have to uphold. It could be a quest that you were given or forced into by your family or loved ones or a group that you work for. And either way, you are compelled to follow this bond because it is your duty.
Now, that doesn't mean that your bond has to put your character on a set of rails towards a single quest like a laser line. You do want to still make your bonds somewhat open-ended and adaptable so that the Dungeon Master can integrate them into the campaign and to the storyline that you might be following along with. So having your bonds be things like your character's deity, or your warlock patron, or the wizard school that you went to, or perhaps even the nation that your character grew up in, or the oath that they made as a paladin. These can often connect directly to your character's class in a very meaningful way and give your character something that they are beholden to or something that they want to achieve. On the other hand, your bonds could also be an obligation that is hanging over your character's head, like a really bad debt, or that ring that they're supposed to take to a volcano to throw it in and destroy it, or the oath or pilgrimage that they must complete at some point in their life.
Your bond could also be another player character. If you don't have any other options, a great way to create a bond is that you are here to protect one of the other characters. This is a classic example of the Samwise Gamgee from Lord of the Rings, whose bond was to protect Frodo. He was given that bond by Gandalf, and he saw to it that he saw it through to the end, to the best of his abilities. And that could be a simple enough bond to carry you through an entire campaign.
I made a promise, Mr. Frodo. You watch over him. And in that, you have a great way to start a bond. You made a promise. What was it? Who was it to? Why did you make that promise? That's a fantastic bond to start any character with.
Be aware that when you're creating your bond, you're possibly creating a situation that will cause adversity or problems for your character during the campaign. If you are bound to a family or loved one or another character, them being put into danger is a great way to call your character into action. You need to be okay with this idea because that is how great stories are made. Your character needs to care about something, and when the things they care about are threatened or put into danger, that is when they become heroic.
Many players make their characters be orphans with no family or no friends, and this is often to their detriment. It means their character has very little that they care about in the world beyond themselves or maybe money. And those could be interesting bonds, but if you want to turn your character's bonds inward like that, you need to make sure that those bonds are turned so inward that they go outward. That your character is so selfish and so obsessed with money that they are compelled to act. And they are compelled to go on adventures. So even if you want to invent a selfish bond for your character, it should be one that causes them to reach out into the world, not retreat from it. Now, we've talked about all the ways that your character's ideals and their bonds can create problems for them, but the last one is actually purpose-built around the idea of creating problems for your character, and that's your character's flaw. And I think both Kelly and I really strongly believe in this. Flaws are something that scares a lot of players, and oftentimes I've seen many players that treat their character flaw like that job interview question when the job interviewer asks you, what is your greatest flaw? And players always try to turn it into a positive. I encourage you to not do this.
I think flaws are best when they create problems, or I'm not even going to call them problems. Let's call them interesting roleplay scenarios at the table.
Interesting complications, should we say.
Complicated roleplay scenarios. But more and more, as I examine my own flaws and the flaws I see in other people, something that I've learned is that flaws are often a mirror of some of your greatest attributes. For example, myself, I think that I am highly creative. This is one of my greatest attributes. I have a very active imagination. This also causes anxiety because my overactive imagination creates scenarios that probably will never happen, and I worry about them. This is both my greatest flaw and my greatest asset. Something to keep in mind when designing your flaws, that they could be something that ties to your personality traits, ideals, and bonds that have created a flaw within you.
Consequently, I am a horrible procrastinator, have been my entire life. But I work really well under pressure, and I'm someone that can get results pretty quickly. It's just that often I know that I can usually finish something so quickly, so I tend to leave it to the very last minute.
Now, when we're designing flaws using these, be careful about using your own personal flaws, because sometimes the personal flaws that we have are very human elements, but in a game of Dungeons and Dragons, we want heroic flaws. So what I recommend is, if you do have a personal flaw you want to bring to the forefront, dial it up a bit. For the two characters that Monty and I just expressed, you have an anxious, nervous character and a procrastinator character. A character who might not make plans, or might say, we don't need a plan, I'll make one up in the last moments before we get there. Versus a character who's like, why don't we have a plan? I'm not going in there with all those monsters. What's the plan? There is no plan. It creates a really fun dynamic at the table for you to play off of now.
Yeah, a character that is really anxious and nervous might need to be constantly reassured by the other characters in the party. And that can create a really fun dynamic where it's like, don't worry, we'll be totally fine. We'll figure it out when we get there.
You say that every time, yet the monsters ripped Joe apart last game.
Yeah, but we're not going to know what's actually in the dragon's lair till we're in the dragon's lair. So there's no point in us making a plan because it's going to change.
Oh, that makes me scared. I don't know about that, man.
It'll be totally fine. We'll definitely survive.
And there you have it. Role-playing.
Your character's flaws could be foolish and self-destructive, but you do also want to counterbalance this by making sure that your character's flaws don't pull them away from adventure or create too much conflict with the other players at the table. If your character's flaw is that they are a kleptomaniac and you're constantly stealing from your party members, that's going to create conflict in the game, and so it might not create a positive or interesting compulsion. So oftentimes I do find that it is worth discussing character flaws at session 0 and looking out for all the ways that flaws can negatively impact the game. We have found in our experience that sometimes when a character succumbs to their flaws and it causes the party to lose a combat encounter have been some of the most memorable and interesting role-playing experiences in our games of Dungeons & Dragons, but some people may find that frustrating, so we recognize that's not for everybody necessarily.
When you're designing your flaws, you don't have to lean on things like procrastination or anxiety or nervousness. You can actually go many different routes here. There are many fears and phobias or vices and addictions that you can tie your character to. Perhaps they're a great warrior who's seen many battles and now drinks all the time to try to forget those battles. And now they need to stop at every tavern along the way to have a brew before they go into adventure. This could cause problems. They're on a time crunch and you need to stop in the tavern for your drink. There are a lot of different avenues that you can take with this. And again, it's best to be simple. Something that you can role play on reliably every time it comes up. You don't want to pick a flaw like, I have horrible existential dread and the vastness of the universe terrifies me, because that's kind of hard to roleplay on a dime during the game. You might have fun with it, and you might want to add that in as a secondary flaw that could be fun to roleplay. But something like, I'm afraid of undead, or I need to drink in every tavern, or fire scares me, are great flaws, so that when the wizard casts Fireball, you always run away and are like, oh man, Fireball, no. It could be really interesting to play on more relevant elements that are going to come up often in the game.
Greed, lust, avarice, pride, all of these classic 7 deadly sins make for fantastic and easy to remember and actionable flaws that will get your character into trouble. These things can be addictions, they can be compulsions, they can be obsessions, they should be vices. It might be that your character will always do anything for a pretty face. Your character might never say no if enough gold is put in front of them. Your character might need to eat at every single opportunity that they see food presented to them. These are simple things. They are flaws, and they are actionable, and they will lead to interesting scenarios at the game table that might be disruptive, and give your character something to play against as well. Your character doesn't always have to work towards overcoming their flaws so much as managing their flaws. In literature, there's this classic example of the tragic flaw, which often refers to the classic story of the king Oedipus, who ignores the warnings of a blind seer and relentlessly pursues a horrible truth which destroys him in the end, that he killed his father and married his mother. A tragic flaw like this can be kind of hard to pull off because it's actually the interplay between a character's ideals, bonds, and flaws. That's the result of the whole story of Oedipus, is that he believes in the truth. He is loyal to his city and his kingdom and solving the problem, and yet he ignores the warnings to not pursue this path. So that is a very complex interplay, which it's hard to conceptualize in a tragic flaw because it's really the compound effect of everything about a character together.
You could take that, though, and the flaw could be simply, I ignore warnings and facts based on what I believe.
Yeah, and so you can get into a lot of complexity here, but that level of complexity might not be necessary depending on the exact interplay and role-playing experience that you want to have at your table.
In summary, a flaw should be something that is actionable and could get you into trouble. You want to be careful about things that are going to negatively affect the entire party, but you want to look for things that will cause interesting dynamics within the party. There's a fine line there, and falling on the more humorous and fun side is always a reliable way to go. If you can have interesting interactions between the player characters at the table because of differing flaws, that is going to be fun for everybody.
And definitely the key thing when you are coming up with flaws is don't do that job interview strategy of coming up with a non-flaw. That's counterproductive to what you're actually doing. When you create a non-flaw, you're essentially creating a personality trait or perhaps an ideal for your character. You're not actually creating a real flaw.
And so with all of these elements, your personality traits, your ideal, your bond, and your flaw, some of the key elements we're focusing on here when designing these actionable items for your character to roleplay is to, first of all, make them actionable. Make them simple enough and something that you can latch onto and reliably pull upon every time you sit down at the table. Convoluted and heavy, deep dives into character backstory and the tragic flaws that they have that have these weaving stories that go on for hours are not necessarily the greatest thing to put in here. You want one sentence, simple ideas that you can use time and time again to make a more three-dimensional character and have more interesting interactions at the table. Keep them actionable and keep them simple, and you're good to go.
And at the same time, be open to discovering new things about your character in play. People change, and your character is, when you're making them, is just at the start of their adventure. Their adventure is going to affect them, is going to change them, is going to alter what their ideals might be, might give them new bonds or change their bonds. They might realize that they have a flaw that they didn't see before. Be open to these evolutions and write down new bullet points as they emerge. If it turns out, oh yeah, actually my character does believe in something, or this might be a flaw for them, add it to your character sheet just as you would the treasure, experience points, and new character abilities you pick up. These things will be added to the tapestry of your character across the entirety of the campaign. Your character is not utterly and completely fixed in place at the start of the campaign. They're going to grow, they're going to change. This is just a set of starting points.
So this has been a look at creating compelling character traits, ideals, bonds, and flaws in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Tell us about some of your favorites that you've used in your game in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the work that we do here on YouTube, please consider joining our community by following the links in the description below.
Also, our live play Dungeons of Drakkenheim is coming to Kickstarter. We've partnered with Ghostfire Games to bring this campaign to life as a 5th edition module. You can follow the links below to join the mailing list to be up to date on all the information surrounding this Kickstarter. And don't forget to check out our live play in the Worlds of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we have plenty more guides for players in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time
In the dungeon.